All right, so this is going to be a little experimentation, see how well it goes. We're going to call it kitchen table theology. And today's question is, could God make a boulder or a mountain, insert whatever geological artifact you prefer, so big that he couldn't move it himself? Now, this is an interesting question because what it's really asking us is, are there parameters or limits to God's omnipotence? And what kind of coherence or logic is there to God's universe? And if there is coherence or logic to God's universe, then does that mean that God himself is within limitations, right? Those parameters that the first question alluded to. And so the implications are that if there are limitations to God, then God is not really omnipotent. And then perhaps we should be searching for the thing that is above God, right? And so perhaps it is math, or perhaps it is science, or perhaps there are these universal laws that God himself cannot escape. And so God then moves away from being perhaps the omnipotent, almighty, all-powerful deity that most people kind of picture when they hear the word God, to something maybe more anthropomorphized, like we would see within like the Greek pantheons. This is very fascinating to me because I think it almost emerges from classical assumptions about who God is and what God can do. And what do I mean by classical? Well, classical refers to the Greek mode of thinking which has influenced Western understanding of God. You see, around the turn of the century, when the Christian church began to become more Gentile than it was Jewish, what you begin to see and notice is that there is this desire to attempt to justify or make sense of the religion of the Christians in the eyes of the wider Roman world, right? And so you begin to see different schools of thought develop. You have people like Clement who want to try to make sense and begin to infuse the Christian message with a Greek understanding or a Greek style of thinking. And then you have people like Tertullian who is going to say, what does Rome have to do with Jerusalem? And he's going to throw it all outside. But the question is, can God make a boulder or a mountain so big that he himself can't move? And that's very fascinating because what we would have to conclude is that that question in of itself is impossible, right? Because what we're describing is something material. And so if God is the maker of all material things, then he himself is going to be able to move or shift or change or transform all material objects because he is the one who himself has made them. However, going back to the question of parameters or limitations, I just want to discuss that for a moment because you see, in the Greek style of thinking, God is not only omnipotent and omniscient and omnipresent, but he's also timeless because time is it's what you would define change by. And if God never changes, then God does not experience time. And so if you think of the world as, let me get my little prop here. So if you think of like the world as this, and then if we think of Dr. Octopus right here as God, then God exists outside of the world, and so then time and space are over here and God's over here, and the two do not get affected at all. Why does this matter? Well, this matters because if God is outside of time and space where you and I exist, then can God really be affected by what happens over here? If God exists outside of it, then can God feel? Can God experience compassion like the Bible says he can? Well, I would argue that no, he can't, that those two are incoherent and incohesive. And so what you find in the Jewish style of thinking is that actually God, when he created earth, right, when he set the world into motion, that he set time and space, the time-space continuum, into being. And so he chose to willingly enter into the time-space continuum so that he could have legitimate relationship with people and with his created beings. And I think this is really interesting because then that means that God is willingly entering into something that he has created. And so in a sense, he is allowing himself to be limited by it, right? He is affected by the things that creatures do. And so he can be moved to compassion, or he can be moved to anger, or he can be moved to justice, etc. Now, I'm not saying that God cannot come out of that time-space continuum, because that matrix that he created, he himself is made, right? Going back to that mountain. He made that mountain, he made that matrix, and so he can affect it. He can move it, he can change it. But it's really fascinating that for God to be able to have actual relationship with people and with us, he decides to enter into the time-space continuum so that he can experience the limitations of things, and then that is then fully experienced in the person of Jesus, who not only is God within this space experiencing relationship, but is now God incarnate with flesh and bone and limited to the things that you and I are as humans, and now completely subject to them, so that full relationship can be had. And that is why writers in the New Testament discuss Jesus being the high priest who can fully empathize and sympathize with you and I. Interesting things. Well, that was episode 1 of Kitchen Table Theology. Feel free to put some comments down below if you want to hear a particular question be answered. And this is the space for that ridiculous question that everybody laughs about or that no one has been able to answer. I can't guarantee that I'll be able to answer it, but I'll make an effort to do it, because that's what, conversation's all about. So thank you so much for watching the video. Make sure to like it, share it, and subscribe.